a interest receivable account to kind of tell themselves that, hey, you have to collect this interest in 3 months' time. Okay, so that's for notes receivable. Okay, so this is kind of going further into depreciation, right? In the earlier part of this class, when I showed you the depreciation adjusting entry example, right, that was just kind of a simple average cost of how we can calculate depreciation. And so now in this slide, I would then go into further details on what are the different methods to calculate depreciation expense, right? And that is based on this example that we've gone through in class. So in this example, right, the firm bought a new delivery truck for $17,000 at the beginning of the year, right? And it has a residual value estimate of $2,000. So residual value would mean at the end of the useful life, when the firm is done using the truck, they estimate that they can sell the truck for $2,000, or they can, scrape it, and the scrap metal would be worth $2,000. Okay. They also further estimate that the truck would have a useful life of 5 years, right? So now we're going to assume that the firm adjusts for depreciation expenses annually as at the year end. And under different depreciation methods, how can we actually calculate the annual depreciation expenses? Okay. The first method that kind of we introduced in class would be the straight line method. Okay, so straight line method actually would just be the simple average, but of course, the key is you have to minus off the residual value. Okay, so do remember this formula over here for straight line method. We first have to take the cost of the asset minus off its residual value at the end of useful life, divided by the years of useful life that we are planning to use the truck for. So in this example, it would be $17,000 minus $2,000 of residual value divided by 5 years of useful life, meaning that our annual depreciation for the truck would be $3,000. Right, and in this depreciation schedule, right, we can see how it is computed. Okay, we simply take 15K, which is 17 minus 2K, multiplied by 1/5, because we intend to use it for 5 years. That would give us $3,000. Okay, so every year for under straight line method, depreciation expense should remain constant at $3,000. Okay, and in the first year, right, we would have accumulated depreciation for that year, $3,000. That would then reduce our net book value by $3,000, right? So first we start off with 17K minus of 3K, that would be $14,000, right? In the second year, accumulated depreciation would be depreciation expense for that year, 3K, plus accumulated depreciation from the previous year, 3K. So in the second year, total accumulated depreciation would be 6K, right? And then we further reduce the book value by $3,000. Okay, so the key for this schedule is that at the end of the 5th year, my net book value should be the same as my residual value. Okay, so it's $2,000 over here, which shows that after I take off my residual value, I allocated the cost of 15K over the course of 5 years, bringing my net book value of my truck to $2,000. Okay, so this is for the straight line method, and I guess this would be pretty straightforward to calculate. Now, the second method of depreciation that we covered in class would be what we call the declining balance method, right? And for the purpose of this module and for the purpose of your exams, when I talk about declining balance method, it would always be double declining balance, which is 2 times, right? Of course, in practice, declining balance could be different multiples like 2, 3, 4, or 5, but for the purpose of our class, it would always be double declining balance, which is 2 times the specified rate. Okay, so how do we calculate sort of depreciation expense under declining balance method, right? For the formula, it would be the remaining book value as at the end of each period, right, multiplied by the accelerated depreciation rate. Okay, how do we calculate the accelerated depreciation rate? We are going to take the specified rate, and in our case, it is going to be 2, right, multiplied by 1 over useful life. Okay, which means that because in the purpose of our class, it is always 2, right? So the specified kind of the accelerated depreciation rate would always be 2 over useful life. Right, now let us look at the example. Okay, so same kind of numbers as before. The truck cost $17,000, 5 years of useful life, $2,000 of residual value. Now, under the declining balance method, we do not deduct the $2,000 residual value when calculating depreciation expense at the start. Okay, we simply take the direct book value. So book value when we first purchased the truck would be $17,000. Okay, first year of depreciation would be 17K multiplied by 40%. Okay, how did I get 40%? Okay, recall under the normal straight line depreciation method, because we divide it by 5 years, the normal rate would be 1/5. Okay, and under double declining, we are going to take 2 times 1/5, which is 2/5, which is then 40%. Okay, so that is the depreciation rate under double declining balance method. So in the first year, I am taking 40% multiplied by 17K. Depreciation expense is 6.8K. Accumulated depreciation is also 6.8K. And for book value, I am taking the ending book value from the previous row minus accumulated depreciation equals to 10.2K. Okay, now to calculate the depreciation expense for the second year, I'm going to take 10.2K multiplied by 40% once again, arriving at my depreciation expense of $4,080, right? Accumulated depreciation is 6.8K plus 4080 equals to 10880. Okay, so book value would be 17K minus 10880, giving me 6120. Now I'm going to repeat the same thing for the third and fourth year, and only in the fifth year, my computation is going to differ slightly, right? So in the fifth year, this is where the consideration of residual value come into play, right? I know that my ending book value cannot go below $2,000 of residual value, so my depreciation expense for the fifth year would simply be the starting book value, 2203, minus my residual value that I cannot go below, which is 2K, right? So my depreciation expense is only 203. All right, this would help my ending book value to be $2,000, which is also the residual value, right? So let me repeat that. Because I know that my ending book value cannot go below my residual value of $2,000, so the depreciation expense in the final year under declining balance would be just the ending book value from the previous year minus residual value equals to my depreciation expense. Okay, so this is how we would calculate our depreciation expense under the double declining balance method. Okay, finally, we would have what we call the units of output depreciation method, right? For this, it is basically how many units I'm going to use, right? Then how many units I'm going to depreciate it by. Okay, the general kind of idea is that I would record more depreciation when the item is being more heavily used. Okay, so in this example, right, we bought a $35,000 truck with an estimated salvage value of $5,000. Okay, and we estimate that we're going to drive the truck for a total of 60,000 miles. Okay, so how do we look at the formula for units of production? First, we would take the cost of the truck minus the residual value divided by total units of output. Okay, so in this example, that would be $35,000 minus $5,000 of salvage value divided by 60,000 miles in total. That would be 50 cents of depreciation expense per mile driven. Okay, so say for example, in that year, the question tells you that the truck was being driven for 17,000 miles, right? To calculate the annual depreciation expense, you would simply take 17,000 miles multiplied by 50 cents per mile, which would give you $8,500 annual depreciation for that particular year. Okay, so this would be units of output depreciation method. Now, we next move on to kind of accounts payable, right? And in accounts payable, part of financing, right? We also introduce the concept of note amortization, where a note amortization is simply the flip side of notes receivable, right? So on the one hand, you have notes receivable from the company, from its customers, and on the other hand, on the person who owes or on the customer's account, right, you would have a note payable. Okay, so in this example, right, on 1st of January 2026, ABC issued a 15-year, $720,000 note payable where they borrowed from XYZ Bank. Okay, so some parameters given, the note carries an annual interest of 10%, right, and is fully paid over 180 months, right? So 12 times 15 years would be 180 months with monthly installments of $8,000. So the accountant prepared the following amortization table that is partially shown below, right? And this is kind of the format that we introduced in class, which I find helpful to learn for your final exam. Okay, so on the issue date, right, of course, we do not pay anything yet. So the unpaid balance would be the total principal of $720,000. Now, in the next period, right, because this is monthly installment, the next period would be the following month, 1st of February 2026. And the question says that the monthly payment is $8,000. Okay, how we calculate the interest expense would be following this formula, where we take the monthly interest rate multiplied by the previous unpaid balance, right? So interest rate is always quoted per annum basis, that is 10%. We are going to divide it by 12 because we need the monthly interest rate multiplied by the previous unpaid balance of 720K. So interest expense for the first period would be $6,000. Okay. Next up would be the principal reduction, and we can simply follow the formula in blue over here, where it is the monthly payment of 8K minus of the interest expense of 6K, which means that we reduced our principal by $2,000. Okay, how do we think about principal reduction? It simply means that out of the $8,000 that we paid, $6,000 goes towards interest expense and $2,000 reduces the value of the loan that we took out, right? So it means that for the unpaid balance, we are going to take $720,000 minus of principal reduction of $2,000 equals to $718,000 of unpaid balance. Now, interest period for the following months would be on 1st of March. Monthly payment remains the same. Interest expense would now be 10% divided by 12 months times 718,000, right, from the previous row. That would be interest expense of 5,983. Principal reduction would be 8K minus 5,983 equals to 2,017. Okay, and the unpaid balance, of course, would be 718,000 minus 2,017 equals to 715,983. Okay, so generally for note amortization, as long as you understand the logic of how each column is being derived, then you should be able to produce an amortization schedule as such if you are given different parameters. Okay, so that's for note payable or note amortization. Now, that is kind of what we went through for financial accounting. And if you recall, after we talked about financial accounting, we then moved on to managerial accounting, right? And specifically for your group case assignment, we also kind of went into more details about what managerial accounting decisions can look like and how it can affect the firm. And I gave you two kind of real life case examples in Tesla and in BYD. Right? So how do we first think about the differences between financial accounting and management accounting, right? There was a slide like that I introduced in class.